So yeah, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, which is sponsored by the California Fire Science Consortium. My name is Tara Ursel, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. I'm the coordinator for the Sierra Nevada region of the California Fire Science Consortium, which is a fire science outreach organization. Our mission includes increasing communication between fire researchers, managers, policymakers, tribes, landowners, homeowners, and other stakeholders. The California Fire Science Consortium is part of the nationwide Fire Science Exchange Network, which is funded through the Joint Fire Science Program and CAL FIRE. You can find information about our upcoming events as well as other fire science information at our website, cafirescience.org. And also, so this talk will be recorded, like I just mentioned, and a link will be posted on that website as well. I'll drop a link to the website in the chat a little later on. If you are having any technical issues, feel free to message me, Tara, in a private chat, and I can help you once we get started. We'll also be using the chat function in Zoom to collect questions for our speaker. So feel free to type in a question at any time, and we'll address them at the end in the order received. Quick question, is Hugh here?
I think I saw him.
Okay. Well, let me just go ahead and introduce you, Saba. So our speaker is Saba Saberi. Saba is a second-year PhD student in the graduate group in ecology at UC Davis, studying fire effects and regeneration patterns in the central Sierra Nevada. Prior to being at Davis, Saba completed her MS at the University of Washington and also worked as a research scientist analyzing forest structure change using aerial and spaceborne LiDAR, as well as aerial photogrammetry. So Saba, please take it from here.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. I'm stoked to be here today. I'm going to apologize in advance for the slight coughing and throat clearing. I've been sick. I'll try to keep that to a minimum. So yeah, I'm really excited today to talk about some of my research that I did for my master's and the two manuscripts that came out of that work. And while it is proceeding? Yeah. While it is based in Washington and the interior Pacific Northwest, I think that the results and implications of those results are broadly applicable to the American West, but of course to California as well. So just a quick kind of primer on the agenda today. I'm going to first spend a little bit of time giving some background and context on what burn severity is, why it's important to measure, and how we measure it. And then I'm also going to go ahead and basically go through each of these two manuscripts whose beginning of their titles you see here. And something that I just want to note is this research that I did at the UW was really kind of born out of the PNW having California envy, as we often have. We didn't really have a thresholding, like a crosswalk between things like RdNBR and basal area loss or canopy cover loss like we do for the Sierra Nevada that was first published in 2009 with the Miller et al. Paper, if you're familiar with that. So I came into grad school and the task was, we love what California has and people use these thresholds to do a lot of really cool research and management. And can we, excuse me, do that here in the interior Pacific Northwest? So yeah. Introduction, briefly, I don't necessarily need to kind of go over this in too much detail for this audience, but as a lot of us know, fire is a really normal and if not necessary process for a lot of forested ecosystems in the American West. We've got a lot of conifer trees that have adaptations like thick bark or aerial seed banks that help them either resist a fire or resprout and reproduce after a fire. So I know we see a lot of kind of intense messaging in the media about devastating wildfires, and that's true because they can be devastating to life and property, but at the same time, a lot of these forests have a fire deficit. So, we've got this increasing fire frequency and severity throughout the West. It's because of, a built up fuels that's a result of fire suppression and it's pretty much total erasure of indigenous fire stewardship and also climate change. So this is a figure here on the left that you can see as this fuel dries up, kind of the wildfire area goes up almost exponentially. And in California in particular, in recent years, as I'm sure a lot of us know, there have been, like a handful of fires that are disproportionately incredibly large in size and in their proportion of high severityness that kind of play an outsized role on homogenizing the landscape throughout the Sierra and other parts of California. So because of the way that our forested ecosystems are changing so rapidly, it's really important that we're able to measure and monitor burn severity so we can detect these changes and see how our ecosystems are responding to those changes. Oh, okay. Well, before I go any further, I just want to quickly mention what am I talking about when I'm going to talk about at length for about an hour about burn severity is specifically the magnitude of change brought upon vegetation by fire. So I'm not talking about, let me see if I can play this briefly. I don't have to. It's just a cool video of fire. Really, I'm not interested in what some people sometimes call fire severity or fire intensity, where they're really just talking about basically the energetic output of fire and the heat of it itself. It's more of a fire physics thing and something that I'm not interested in. I can't click on this, so I'm not going to do it. And I'm going to, this is really what I'm interested in, right? A scene like this. What happened to the forest after the fire? What's that magnitude of ecological change that's been conferred? Looking at things like organic matter loss, the way that the way that storage of carbon can be changed when organic material is burned, conversion of soil into ash, things like that. And so how it's important to track burn severity. How do we measure it? There are two kind of main ways you can do it. You can do it on the ground with field measurements by measuring on individual trees, for example, the height of char is something that you can look at, or you can just count how many trees have been killed by fire and calculate the stem density of that. And we can also use satellite-based remote sensing methods. And those are the two things that I focused on throughout this study. And so now I'm kind of going to go a little bit into the weeds on both of these ways that we measure these things, mostly because it's really important context for the rest of the talk. So I think that if the audience has a better understanding of what exactly we're measuring, you'll be able to interpret the results a little bit better. So this photo here is a photo of me in the field with a colleague calculating the composite burn index. So that's, or CPI, and that's one of the first methods of field-based evaluation of burn severity that we do. It's something that was a protocol that was developed in, I think, 1996 by Key and Benson as a field validation method for Landsat-derived burn severity indices. And so the way that it works, this is actually the data sheet here on the right, and you stand in, you develop a 30-meter diameter circular plot. Why is it 30 meters? It matches the spatial resolution of a Landsat pixel, and this protocol was developed as a validation method, so that's why that number exists. And you basically, as a human being, go through and do a semi-quantitative sort of ocular estimate on how much change you think was conferred to each of 5 strata in the forest. And then ultimately you average each of those numbers to get one overall number for the burn severity plot. It goes from 0 to 3, 0 being completely unburned, nothing was basically touched by fire or very, very little, and 3 being the maximum of a completely burned plot, 100% tree mortality, things like that. So I'm actually going to go through each of the strata and kind of talk you through what it would look like if you were an analyst on the ground. So you start out with the understory, and you look at the substrate, right? So you're looking at litter, duff, small and large fuels that are downed, and you're just giving a number between 0 and 3 for that level of the forest. And here I've got an arrow down. You can see a lot of this stuff is fairly burned, so I might give that kind of a higher value for the substrate, like maybe a 2.5. Then you go to strata 2, which is herbs, low shrubs, trees less than a meter tall. And so you're looking and you can see there are some shorter trees here that were completely burned. So I might give that a high value as well. And this is a point where you also kind of really look at the ground and make sure that there's not, for example, a really small tree that was burned in its entirety and fully consumed and you don't see it anymore. So you do kind of have to do this mental gymnastics of sort of looking for evidence of stuff that might be there before, but isn't there anymore because it was consumed by fire. Then we go up to tall shrubs and trees between 1 and 5 meters in height, and we assess how much mortality or change from fire that level's got. Up to the overstory, so now we're looking at sub-canopy and kind of like those pole-sized trees. Here you can see that anything that's sort of a shorter tree and not a dominant tree in the canopy has been burned. The needles are red, and so a lot of those are probably dead. And then finally down to the large dominant trees. You can't see this really thick ponderosa here, but it is alive in the top of the photo. So, there's a lot of char height on that tree. It's not really that high, but there's a lot of it around the bowl. But you know that there's not a severe mortality cause on that class of tree. So another thing to note is that, you do this assessment in these 5 classes, but if one of those levels isn't really dominant, like let's say it's an even age sand, and there's really everything's kind of co-dominant with each other, you just don't include that level. And because it's ultimately an averaged number for the whole plot, like that's okay. And previous work has shown that CBI is really useful because it's quick to implement. You can basically, if you've done it many, many times, you can kind of show up in a plot within 10, 15 minutes, get a pretty good like qualitative estimate of how high the burn severity is there. And it's supposed to work across different forest types and communities. It was developed to be fairly standardized. And CBI also generally corresponds well to measures of plant injury or tree mortality. So it's a really nice tool that we have when we're trying to get basically as many plots we can on the ground because it's not super intensive. And then I do want to speak a little bit about the caveats to it, and basically, a large impetus for this research is that, this plot that you see here in front of you, it could have an overall CBI value of 1.5, but if that's the only piece of information you have about a given plot, you don't really know what's going on within the strata, right? It's a single variable that's collapsed a lot of other levels into it, and so it can actually obscure some dimensions of bird severity and miss nuances, which is why sometimes, folks who are interested in more specific aspects of how fire has affected vegetation on the landscape might not necessarily be super interested or gain much value from CBI. Also important to note that there is a little bit of subjectivity with the user. If you across the board, I think there's about 16% differences amongst trained technicians who use CBI, but that's basically good enough, right? Like you train someone really well, you're most likely going to get the same answers. So CBI is like the first pass, right, at us kind of getting initial, excuse me, view of burn severity on the landscape. But like I just mentioned, there is a fair amount of nuance that you miss if that's the only thing you measure. So how do you capture more dimensions? You specifically measure in the field that thing that you're interested. And so here you see a list of 8 individual measures of burn severity that I measured in my work in the field, and it's based off of previous work that my advisor Brian Harvey had done in the Intermountain West and the Rockies. And basically these are measurements of things that are that exact sort of ecological value that we care about, right? So we care about how much live canopy cover has been converted to dead. We also developed something called a dead needle index. It's an ordinal index from 1 to 7 that kind of gets at, okay, a tree is alive, it's got all of its green needles on it, or it's got a little bit of scorching on it. Some of the needles are brown, but it's mostly green, and so on and so forth, till you end up at a tree that is completely burned and has lost all of its needles. We calculated killed basal area and killed trees. We also measured bull scorch, and this is basically looking at an individual tree and looking at the circumference of the bowl at the base and seeing what proportion of it was burned. So if the whole kind of ring around the tree is burned, that's 100%. If only a portion of it is, we'll give an ocular estimate. Let's say like, okay, it's about a third, we'll give it 33%, something like that. Char height is a specific quantitative measure of we looked at maximum char height at trees using a laser rangefinder to kind of shoot exactly the height at which we've got the highest point of char height. Deep char is something that we also developed an index for. And deep char, what I want you to think about is like when you've, had a campfire and a log has burned for a couple hours, right? It's like long sustained smoldering combustion, and it gets kind of crackly and sort of looks like almost like scales on an animal. That is something that we were interested in measuring because it's kind of a good indicator of smoldering combustion. And It's not something you can really get at with CBI, which I'll talk about at length later. And then lastly, surface char. Some of these are measures that are more strictly related to canopy measures of burn severity, but we also wanted to get a sense in each of our plots that we measured what's going on the surface. And that looked like dropping a chaining pin every 10 centimeters along the center of the plot and seeing if what we hit was burned. So these were the 8 measures that we worked with. And there a big knowledge gap, at least that we had at the time in the interior Pacific Northwest, is how these individual measures specifically relate to CBI. There's very few studies that will get CBI and all of these things that I listed. Usually, you'll just get CBI because it's a quick thing, or you'll just get canopy cover loss. I know Ellen Whitman in 2018 had a paper out where she got CBI and a couple of indices out in Canada. But broadly speaking, this data set that I'm talking about today is the only one of its kind that I know and the largest. So I just gave a quick primer on these field measures that we calculated or measured in the field, and a quick overview on the satellite remote sensing component of it. What's really nice about using satellite remote sensing is, one, that you don't have to go out into the field, and 2, you can produce like a wall-to-wall map of burn severity within a fire perimeter. Satellites like Landsat basically use reflected light from they'll get a spectral reflectance back from the Earth's surface, and they'll partition that energy into different bands. And we can do different math with these bands to get at different wavelengths of light that tell us information about plants, which is ultimately really what at least I care about. And so the 2 main bands that are kind of, we think about when we're looking at post-fire effects on an area are the near infrared band and the shortwave infrared band. Near infrared is sensitive to plant cell structure and therefore relates pretty well to plant productivity. Shortwave infrared is sensitive to water content. Its values go up when you have more ash and soil. So folks, again, in the 90s, developed what's called the normalized burn ratio. That's NBR right there. They difference these 2 bands to get an estimate of fire cause effects. So you can see there in the red, that's probably where vegetation has been burned. And you might be familiar with a map like this. And so from the normalized burn ratio, we've got a slew of other metrics, namely the difference normalized burn ratio, which really gets at subtracting a post-fire image from a pre-fire image, so you can get that change over time. And then RdNBR is the relativized difference normalized burn ratio. And that helps us so that we don't get wildly different values if there's initially really low vegetation. But in, I believe, 2014, Sean Parks developed RBR, which kind of gets at some of the mathematical challenges that there are with RdNBR. Mostly that square root transformation can cause really extreme values at extreme values of pre-fire vegetation. And also it can, if you've got a 0 in the denominator, right, you can't calculate that, which is why we've added the 1 point. And so this was, you don't really need to know much about this in extreme detail, besides the fact that there were multiple different indices to calculate burn severity, and the most commonly used one is often RdNBR. And there's also no consensus on which one of these performs best. There's been a ton of studies on it, and sometimes depending on the area of interest, some might say that RBR works better. Some people might just have a preference because they know about that square root transformation issue. And so another part of my research task was to figure out in the Northwest which one of these performs the best. So I'll talk about that later as well. So that concludes kind of the introduction primer on all that you need to know in order to be able to better understand what I'm going to chat about. So here I'm going to go into what we did for this first manuscript, which is punnily named Do CBI, what I see the relationship between composite burn index and these 8 quantitative measures of field measured burn severity across gradients of forest structure. So we wanted to know, we had 2 main research questions. In the interior Pacific Northwest, 1, how does CBI relate to these 8 independent quantitative field measures of burn severity? And 2, does that relationship differ if you look at different gradients of forest structure, which, at the get-go, we were hoping / assuming that there wouldn't be much difference because this metric is ultimately developed to be applicable across a broad region. But because it hadn't been empirically tested, we wanted to ask questions. question. So we went ahead and over the course of 2 summers, hit about 14 fire perimeters that we had identified with the help of our collaborator at GTAC, Craig Baker, who just informed us of this. This is all 1 year post fire. And so getting those perimeters that basically the year immediately after can sometimes be kind of hard because the monitoring trends and burn severity program can have a little bit of a lag. So we're really grateful to have someone on the inside helping us out with that. And we went a year post-fire and measured a total of 315 plots across all these states, kind of spanning the entire sort of forest type gradient. We also took care to kind of get some fires on the east side of the Cascade Crest, as well as the west side, which is wetter. And we just basically know less about fire on the west side of the crest. So that was something we wanted to make sure that we measured. And so in the field, what did we do? This is kind of a childish mock-up of what a plot looks like. We set up a 30-meter diameter plot. We've got the GPS point in the center. And before we did any other like specific measurement, we did the CBI protocol first. And that was so us as analysts wouldn't bias our estimates of CBI. If we went ahead and measured, let's say, a bunch of char heights and they were all like 50 meters high, we would already be like a little bit biased and say, okay, this is a really severe plot or severely burned plot. And it might cause us to give a really high value for CBI that we wouldn't have given if we just did that first. So we kind of made sure to avoid bias in that way by doing CBI protocol first. Then we did those canopy cover measures that I talked about. That's using a densiometer walking along each of those dashed lines that you see in the figure there, and basically counting up the live and dead canopy cover that there was. We measured surface char, like I mentioned before, with the chaining pin. And we also got individual measurements on the 20 tallest trees in the plot, 5 in each quadrant. Why did we choose the tallest trees? Because basically they're the best like yardstick or measuring stick for the maximum effects that fire could have. If we chose a bunch of short trees, we would likely basically miss like higher flame lengths that there would be. And so we measured, dead needle index, the deep char index, the proportion of the scorch, and those char height measures. So that's kind of what that looked like in the field. And now, before I get into the results, I'm kind of going to talk about the model framework that we use to analyze this, because this is kind of the really cool opportunity that I had to basically update the statistics from the 2009 Miller paper that I've mentioned before. So, the nature of this data is kind of sigmoidal in nature, because at 0, 0, unburned, you're going to have a lot of plots at that end, and then a totally burned on the bottom here, the x-axis, that's a 0 to 3 CBI. And for the entirety of this research, we converted every measure of burn severity to a proportion. So everything was standard. A 0 would be unburned, 0.5 would be basically like 50% burn severity of whatever individual metric. And we also converted CBI to proportion as well. So it was standard across all variables. And so, people might initially look at the data and try to do a linear regression, and that just doesn't really work. One, because you can see the curved nature of the data, so it's not really a good fit. The next kind of natural step is to think about a logistic regression, which also doesn't really work in this case of having burn severity data either, because logistic regressions are used to predict a binary outcome, like a success or a failure. But the whole point of this research is that we're really beyond like a 0 or a 1, or there's more nuance than just burned, not burned. So that's why a logistic regression wasn't really the best fit either for like the modeling framework. So you might be asking at this point, okay, I know a lot about stats. What about a beta regression, where you can have response variables that are between 0 and 1? And that's kind of a good fit, but still not great enough, because it doesn't actually allow you to have 0 and 1. It just lets you have the stuff in between. And so that's what leads us to the framework that we ultimately ended up using, which is a 0 and 1 inflated beta regression. That lets us have zeros, ones, and everything in between. I started calling them ZOIBs at some point in grad school, so you can see that acronym there. And so, yeah, this is finally, after a bit of toying with it, we finally came to the conclusion that this was a good model fit. for the structure. And so how did we assess basically the strength of these models? Well, we decided to use the area under the receiver operating curve, which is actually, I found out, a metric they developed in World War II around right after the Pearl Harbor attack, because we wanted to be able to test if we were getting Japanese aircraft signals correctly. Anyway, that's kind of a fun aside, but the point is that this model fit measure tells you the rate of true positives to false positives given a specific threshold. So for example, let's say we set a threshold of 50%. We want to know what's the rate that the model that we give it correctly bins the data into above 50% and below 50%. So we actually gave 5 different thresholds to kind of assess to see how well it does at those different thresholds. Let me see if this has an animation, right? So that dashed line is the 50%. And oftentimes a good model would be anything, you know, above 50%. We gave that, that was our lowest threshold cutoff, because we're not really interested in a model or saying that it's a good model if it's not able to classify things less than half the time. And so this light green is an example, AUC of 0.65, right? It's a little bit better. It's a little bit closer to 1. And then dark green, 0.85, that means that 85% of the time your model can accurately determine burn severity at a given threshold. So enough about that. Moving on to the results for this first set of research questions. The first thing we wanted to do is we've collected so much data, and we wanted to just see, using Spearman's correlation matrix, you know, how correlated are these things to each other? And as expected, a lot of them are really highly correlated. Dark blue is a perfect correlation of 1. There's actually nothing here in the red, meaning there's a negative correlation. But I'm going to draw your attention to the fact that deep char isn't really isn't very well correlated to any of these other measurements, right? Which kind of put a pin in it and kind of a flag to think about for later of like all these different measurements. Deep char isn't necessarily, it's capturing something that the other ones aren't, is kind of what we got. But across the board, a lot of these measures correlate with each other. I really like this photo because it gives you a good picture of live and dead canopy. And I'm about to kind of, instead of talking about if you look at the manuscript, there are many, many figures, but I'm kind of going to give you a broad overview of what the results were qualitatively. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is canopy measures of burn severity, right? This was clearly a hot fire, but some of the trees did survive, and you can see that they're green. And so for canopy-based measures of burn severity, for example, like proportion of live canopy cover loss, which is something that we actually had to model the pre-fire live canopy using reference unburned areas nearby, because this was a post-fire study. And you can see the black line and the corresponding like purplish gray polygon around it being the confidence interval around it, kind of follows that sigmoidal shape that I talked about before, and the gray dots in the background are the raw data. And so this was the relationship that we kind of discovered between these two variables. And when we assessed the model fit at each of these 5 thresholds, its average overall was 0.98. So meaning that it's doing a really good job. CBI does a really good job of estimating what would be canopy cover loss across the board. Which again makes sense because it's several of the strata that we measure within CBI include that. So it's really kind of just confirming what we already know, but it's a good relief, right? Because it means that when we're measuring CBI, we're getting a good picture of the canopy measures of burn severity. This is kind of another look of basically a post-fire situation, here being CBI value of 3, for example, total forest mortality in this plot. It's just kind of nice to see, but you can still see there's some surface greenness. And now I want to talk about, oh wait, this is also for killed trees, which is also another canopy-based measure. It's pretty much the same form for the model. And again, really high, strong model fit. But what about the case of deep char, which, you know, when I was first talking about the correlations between all the metrics, and it wasn't that correlated with the other metrics, you know, what's going on there? And so if my verbal description of what deep char looks like wasn't good enough, this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about deep char, and it can present itself in different ways. It could be in the standing dead, if a tree was dead prior to the fire and it had already lost most of its limbs and its bark had been stripped. It's a lot different than a live tree being burned, so you have a lot of time to get your carbon altered like this. And this was the only model amongst those 8 metrics that really did not perform well. Like, we were really unable to get a good estimate from CBI of deep char. The average AUC across the board, I reported it, but frankly, it's not a very meaningful measure because the model didn't do that well. This is another kind of really nice photo that shows what deep char can look like on the landscape. For example, I would give this, let's say, a CBI value of 1.5. Most of the trees are alive. There's a couple ones in the understory that didn't make it and were scorched from the heat of the fire, but not a lot has changed. But if you look at this incredibly massive snag, I would say, I don't know, like upper 2/3 of that are deeply charged. And that's kind of altering the way that carbon's being stored on the landscape, because it's not going to decompose in the same way that a sound or a not burned log would. And so CBI isn't capturing that. This deeply charged snag is biologically unavailable. I mean, wildlife can't necessarily eat it and won't decompose as quickly. I do know that redback woodpeckers do like to live in snag holes, so that is something that I will mention. And so again, this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying a sort of I'm trying to say here, like a big collapsed value like CBI doesn't get these specific dimensions of burn severity that could be really important to you depending on the research question you have or the management objective that you're trying to reach. So that was the main result for that first research question. And the second one was basically, if we did this all over again, but at a secondary covariate stand structure, getting at forest structure, do these relationships change? So we had 5 forest structure variables that we're interested in: stand density, these are all, I believe, pre-fire, basal area, the quadratic mean diameter, the mean tree height, and that modeled pre-fire live canopy cover. So what that analysis resulted in was a truly horrifying mega figure that I had to make for the manuscript that haunts me to this day, but I won't make you look at it for too long. Let's break it down into simpler parts. So the main kind of point here is that for surface measures of burn severity, when you kind of fix the secondary covariate at basically 5th, 50th, and 95th percentiles, or low, medium, high, do those relationships change? And for example, for surface chart here, they don't change that much. These lines all overlap with each other, indicating that the relationships aren't that different. But, excuse me, when you look at a canopy-based measure of burn severity, like that canopy cover change, you can see there's a spread between the lines. And so here, that means that the relationships are sometimes differing. So, for example, if you would give a CBI value of 1.5, but your pre-fire or the forest structure you have is all a bunch of really small trees, that 1.5 is in some ways kind of not really correct. There's actually a higher, it corresponds to higher individual metrics of burn severity. So that was kind of interesting to this because it kind of pointed out that like forest structure does matter, even though this metric was ultimately developed to like be broadly applicable. I think it's important to think about what the structure of the stance that you're thinking about is. Another point I want to make is that some of these metrics kind of had a little bit of a breakdown, is a strong word, but I'll just use it for now, at the higher end of burn severity. So CBI relates to some of those field measures more poorly at that higher end, and that could kind of have implications for, as we see more bigger, larger, high severity fires, the way that we're measuring it might not be the best fit. We had these kind of weaker relationships between CBI and measures like char height, bolt char, or the needle index. So that kind of means that CBI is really better at predicting those independent metrics at lower levels. And part of that is just because, you know, as you kind of go down the graph at 0, 0, both of those metrics are bound by 0. So there's a region of the data where it will have perfect correspondence. But CBI only goes to a maximum of 3, but that number 3 doesn't necessarily capture that full range of high severity recorded by independent measures and plots. And I want to draw your attention to this photo here from Monica Turner's 2019 PNAS paper. This is out here in Yellowstone, and we called this Crown Fire Plus. So this was an area that I believe had about 16-year-old lodgepole pines, and a fire came through in 2016. And not only did it burn all of the trees, but like all of the woody material is completely gone. And I don't know if you can see, there's little, we called it also Stump Town because there were a ton of little stumps there on the ground. And there's a cross hatching pattern of these ghost logs, right? So that any downed logs were completely burnt. And I would not really be comfortable giving that a CBI of 3. Honestly, that's like a 4 or something beyond the scale, right? Because it's this qualitatively a dimension of burn severity that our current methods don't really capture. So I don't really have a solution for that at this point, but it is something that I think about if we start to see kind of novel extreme burn severity. CBI isn't really the best fit. So takeaways. Across the board, generally speaking, CVI models a lot of these individual metrics that we care about pretty well. If you're interested in something like deep char, it really doesn't get at that because it's not well correlated to it. And so I wouldn't use it for that. And forest structure matters. So thinking about what size classes or age classes of trees you have could be impacting any type of analysis that you do. So that was manuscript 1. I'm going to go ahead now and talk about manuscript 2 and kind of shift gears ever so slightly. The methods and everything are all still really pretty similar, but we're thinking about reburns. This paper came out in Fire Ecology last year. What is the color when the black is burned is a reference to a Neil Young song, if you guys know that. And so showing, again, another really awesome photo from Yellowstone, again, of this Crown Fire Plus. Like I said, you know, because we're seeing more fires, just based on the fact that we're seeing more fires and the fact that, you know, land is finite, we're going to have a lot of places that burn over again. And that's not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. If a place is has a fire regime of low frequency, not low frequencies, maybe high frequency, but low severity fires, being reburned multiple times over might be a return to a historical fire regime that we don't currently have. But in places where we're having short interval reburns, right? So seeing fire coming in more frequently than that fire regime of that area raises a lot of really interesting questions, right? Like, where is a reburn doing good work? Where is it actually kind of a bad thing? And so for the purposes of this research, what we defined short interval reburn as an area that experiences fire, 2 fires within 30 years. Yes. And so the research questions for here were, you know, in short interval reburns, does the relationship between individual measures of burn severity and either CBI or RdNBR differ if the first fire is standard placing or not? For the purposes of time and because I've talked about CBI ad nauseum, I'm not going to go over the results from that chunk of the analysis, but they're qualitatively not any different from what I'm going to talk about with the RdNBR. So you should definitely check out the paper if you're interested in that part of it. And so now I'm kind of just going to go through the results from that. And something that I want to say is that there's a lot of research out there that kind of talks about reburns, and some folks like Camille Stevens-Rimmen and Brian Harvey have talked about how the severity of initial fire might mediate the severity of a second fire. But all of that research kind of hinges on the assumed fact that the way that we measure burn severity in a second or third entry fire is giving us the same information as it would be in a first entry fire. And the whole reason why I did this research is because we didn't have any empirical proof of that. So it's really important to basically know, is what we're asking for multiple entry fire, is what we're asking in multiple entry fire really giving us the same answers? A quick note on the remote sensing methods. I've talked about RdNBR, and I decided to use that metric ultimately because I did, I'm going to toggle between 2 slides here really quick. I actually I'd calculated RdNBR, dNBR, and RBR for all of our fires and all of our plots, and compared them to CBI to see what models and what model fit they had, and they were fairly indistinguishable in that they all had very high performance. So I went ahead and just selected RdNBR for the purposes of this analysis because it's such a widely used metric. But I basically have all of the analyses that I'm going to talk about over for these 3. And we got these indices not by using MTBS, which is often what I'll usually do, because again, like I mentioned before, they might have a lag in terms of a fire that just happened last year, might not be posted yet on the website. But thanks to Sean Parks's Google Earth Engine code that he shared, I think in his 2018 paper, he's basically got a script in the Google Earth Engine environment that allows you to repeatedly in a scripted environment and through Google cloud computing power and not your own computational power, get burn severity indices for as many, really many fires. I only ran 14 for this analysis, but you can certainly do it for hundreds. Kind of just run the code in this environment, export the rasters, and then you can do your analysis in R and whatever other platform you use. So just a plug for how easy Google Earth Engine has made it for us to get things like RdNBR. Normally I would have to go back in the day, select an individual pre-fire image and post-fire image and do a lot of stuff manually. Now that's just automated. Nice. Okay, so I talked about how I picked RdNBR. And I just wanted to give a photo of, this is what a stand replacing fire might look like. It might be kind of silly, but all the trees are dead versus in a non-stand replacing fire, you can see that not all of the trees have been killed. And we were interested in asking this research question based on the severity of the first fire, because like we've said, that's kind of what's setting up the biological legacies for the second fire that passes through, versus if we asked it for based on, the terminal fire, you wouldn't really be able to get at that. So within our sampling universe, half of the fires were reburns. And so we were actually able to do this analysis, which if you like or care about reburns, it's fairly hard to find opportunistically, just because, it's kind of partially chance-based and partially just a lot of the logistics of doing that kind of field work can be kind of tough. And so we cross-checked, made sure the plots were actually reburned, using burn severity RdNBR maps from the first fire, which by this point a lot of these were kind of old, so we're able to access that. And then we cross-checked this with our plot photos. So that's how we did that. Again, I'm kind of going to run you through the framework for how this research question worked. So, again, we've got the same kind of S-shaped curve. On the x-axis, we've got a given RdNBR value. On the y-axis, we've got a given, and the values of RdNBR don't really matter in a sense because it's a unitless, basically index. Bigger numbers mean higher severity, and well, what does matter is that these numbers are when they're correlated to individual measures of burn severity, but they don't necessarily mean anything, right? And then, so we, again, doing everything in proportion. So this is what the curve might look like for a non-reburn situation. And we wanted to know, if that first fire was stand replacing, an RdNBR of 500 might correspond, maps here, to, let's say, I don't know, a value of 0.2. But the reality is if it was a stand replacing fire, it might actually be higher. So we might be underestimating it. And conversely, for when the first fire is non-stand replacing, we might be overestimating burn severity. And so that's kind of what is the crux of this research and why it's really important. So again, the figures from this work in the published paper, there's a lot of figures, but I'll kind of focus on the main results, which track really nicely with the results from the first paper, is that for canopy measures of burn severity, killed trees, basal area loss, live canopy cover loss, there's not a lot of difference when you account for that severity in the first fire. These confidence intervals are kind of wide, they overlap, and so that's pretty reassuring, right? So if you're interested in these canopy measures, using RdNBR values in a reburn is pretty much telling you the same thing as it would be in a first fire and a second fire. And then again, similarly, there is some difference when you're looking at surface measurements of burn severity. An RdNBR value of 1,000 for a non-reburn situation might be a little bit more than 50%, for example, surface char. But in reality, the data actually shows that when that first fire is non-stand replacing, it's actually way lower. So we're overestimating in that case. And yet again, deep char was not well captured, or we weren't really able to model it well. Again, if we weren't able to do it in a non-reburn setting, there isn't really a logical reason for why it would perform at all in this reburn setting, but it was nice to kind of corroborate that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about like why I think this is happening. You know, the canopy is this view here on the left from the top down. That's what a satellite is seeing. The reflectance is coming from oftentimes like these tops of the canopy and the trees. So that makes sense that these measures would be making sense regardless of the reburn or not. And so that's sort of just kind of like a first principles things that makes a lot of sense versus for surface measures of burn severity. You can see here, these are some like resprouting plants post-fire. Immediately post-fire, everything might be burned, but in that 1 year time frame until we come back to measure it, stuff might come back. And so RdNBR, we're looking from the top down here. If the canopy is fairly dense, it's really hard to pierce through the canopy with spectral remote sensing to be able to see what's going on below. And that's kind of why I think it's not doing such a good job in this case. And the literature does, you know, suggest that for these low severity, high frequency fire regimes, it's kind of hard to get a good picture of what is going on if the surface and the canopy burn severity dynamics are decoupled. So that's something that, again, depending on the fire regime of the area of interest that you have, might be something that you would want to consider. And again, deep char, like I said, it can't be measured because, or in this case, for reburns, because it wasn't doing a good job in reburn agnostic. And it's not explicitly tied to mortality in the way that something like canopy cover loss might be, but it is telling us something really important about what's going on the landscape, which is why I think it's still important to think about as something really still to think about to this day. So that is the results from both of these papers. And I just briefly wanted to talk about the applications and kind of the future directions of this that I'm really stoked about. The first thing being that, you know, the fact that we have all of these individual burn severity metrics and CBI and RdNBR means we can have really ecologically meaningful wall-to-wall maps of burn severity. Sean Parks in 2019 has this kind of like the first step of this where he produces CBI based maps for entire fire perimeter. Is really cool. But this work allows us to have a map of basal area loss or canopy cover loss, or just say like char heights across the entire fire perimeter, which I know is something that a lot of people ultimately who chat with me care about. So that's an exciting sort of result of this work. And then another thing is that I get a lot of folks asking me, so like, you know, for example, what RBR or dNBR values are associated with 95% canopy cover loss west of the Cascades? That's what some folks at Washington State DNR asked me. And so with my models, I was able to basically produce a lookup table for them and be like, you know, these are kind of the updated thresholds that you should think about. And so it's kind of, it's very important stepping stone to a lot of people's research to have that crosswalk. And because we've gotten so many requests, me and Brian have actually chatted about basically publishing a big data paper where we're going to bring together different data sets that folks have across multiple states and try to kind of bring it together so we can have a really big data set. We can have like a regionalized set of thresholds or a more specific localized set of thresholds. So I think that kind of future work is really exciting. I don't have a timeline on it. It's grad school, so the timeline's forever. But I'm excited to share that with you. And with that, I think that is all I have. Just want to acknowledge Brian and Craig who helped us out, and Monica Turner for letting us come out with her on her Yellowstone work, all of my lab members, all of the people who did this really tough but really fun field work. And yeah, and now I guess I'm happy to take any questions that have popped up in the chat, but I want to thank everyone for their time and their attention.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Saba. That was a really great presentation. And so I've been noting the questions or question as it came into the chat, but please, everyone, drop your questions in there as well. Before I ask this question, I am also going to put our evaluation form in the chat because I know folks tend to drop off. So if you could fill in this evaluation form, it would really help us. It helps us plan future events, and it also helps us report back to our funders. It will take you no longer than like 1 minute, maybe 2 if you have a lot to say. So on to the questions. Do you know, are CBI plots usually collected right after the fire or 1 year post-fire? How is phenology considered,
Yeah,
especially in systems that aren't conifer dominated?
yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, CBI is considered measured in the field about 1 year after fire, kind of at the height of the growing seasons when we try to get at it, because if we came, any earlier, you probably wouldn't have green up. And so we're trying to get basically a snapshot of what was going on about a year after, when all of the plants that would be out are out. Hope that answers that.
Cool. Next, are you aware of any research that incorporates LiDAR in addition to field metrics and spectral indices into burn severity mapping?
That is a really good question, given that I used to work in a LiDAR lab at UW. Off the top of my head, I know that there have been some papers that kind of say, like, that kind of get at that point that I was making earlier, that it's harder to pierce through the canopy with spectral remote sensing versus with LiDAR as an active form of remote sensing. And you can get through the canopy a little bit better. And so if you were to look at any of the research coming out of Van Kane's lab, which is where I used to work, you might be able to find an answer to your question, but nothing is like coming to the top of my head, and I'm sorry about that.
We have, thanks for a great presentation, Saba. Do you have a sense for variability across different amounts of pre-fire density?
Yeah, let me go back to one of that horrifying mega slide, because that density was one of the things that we looked at. And I think, let's see here. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. So we looked at, well, okay, where are we here? Basal, like pre-fire basal area, and that kind of, it was, somewhat variable. So we had basal area in the 5th percentile, going from 3 meters squared per hectare to up to 78, which is really that kind of upper limit of basal area of any forest that's like a really big old growth forest. So we had that full kind of spectrum, or full spread of pre-fire density and different basal areas, and the kind of main result is the same thing, right? And that, like, for canopy measures, it did matter a little bit. You would be over or underestimating depending on if they were smaller or bigger trees, and their associated densities, versus for the surface measures, it didn't. But I would have to dig into the data just to give you a better sense. But I do, based on this quick glance at this and just my memory of that, like, we kind of were able to get at a gradient of different pre-fire densities.
All right. Well, that's all the questions I see in the chat for now. Once again, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you who attended the presentation today. So our next event is actually tomorrow. We kind of have a lot of back-to-back things this week. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., Dr. Scott Stevens is going to be speaking at UC Davis, but we'll also have a Zoom option. Please visit californiafirescience.org for more info.